A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about meritocracy in video games. Extremely fascinating topic. Our guest today is Dr. Chris Paul, professor in the Communication and Media Department at Seattle University. He's published 4 books, including The Toxic Meritocracy of Video Games, Why Gaming Culture is the Worst, and most recently, Free-to-Play mobile video games, Bias and Norms. He's on Twitter as @real_Chris_Paul, but he generally only binge tweets during conferences, and you can reach him at paulc@Seattle U University. All right, welcome to the show, Chris.
Yay! Hey, it's lovely to be here.
All right. So the whole idea of meritocracy in video games is a topic that seems to fit really well. We're going to talk about essentially, first, I wanted us to kind of talk about your ideas about how meritocracy exists in video games or is promoted by video games. And then let's talk about the downside of that. So I want to start by saying that, to me, meritocracy it's supposed to be a good thing. Right. I mean, traditionally the world was very meritocratic. Right. You didn't get your lot in life because you deserved it. You usually got it because of who your parents were or what your social connections were. By contrast, a system with meritocracy, and we should really define meritocracy. So meritocracy is a system where the best qualified get the position, the prize, the accolades, whatever success amounts to?
Yeah, kind of. But I want to make that a little bit more complicated because I think that we're brought up in contemporary society, especially Western society, the US and the UK especially, to think that meritocracy is a good thing, right? And those people that think meritocracies are a good thing are generally the people that benefit from meritocracy, right? And that's really the seductive and interesting thing about meritocracy, that when we start poking at it, it starts to fall apart in some ways that the aristocracy would too. So if we go back a little bit, the term really gets popularized in this book in the 1950s by a guy named Michael Young. And it's this satirical novel where he goes through and he's basically writing it from the future, and where we've gone into a meritocratic society and the world is falling apart. And it's this dark thing, and he tried to get it published all of these places and he wasn't able to get it published. And it's really interesting that the way he got it published was with a chance beach encounter. He met a family friend who was a publisher, and that guy's like, I'll publish it, right? Which, not very meritocratic to be on a beach vacation, right? And to know the guy, right? And all this stuff happens that leads to this book. And then over the course of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and then into the 90s, 2000s, we get in more and more into meritocracy. And sociology and social psychology start poking holes in what this idea is and how it works. So I would define meritocracy as a system by which those who work the hardest and are the most skilled get the best rewards. But that doesn't account for things like luck. That doesn't account for things like where you started. That doesn't account for circumstance very well. And all of those things really complicate meritocracy. And as I was going in to set up this book and reading more about meritocracy, I learned that there was history to meritocracy. So I read one historical exploration of the Chinese empires over time, and I talk about it a little bit in the book. And basically, there are various Chinese empires that go back and forth from meritocracy to nepotism, to meritocracy to nepotism. Yeah. Because once you establish yourself as the ruling class, you tend to cut off all the ladders up and solidify your regime, right? And then you say it's meritocratic, but it's not. So that I think that those are some places where we can leverage on and poke some holes in this idea that meritocracy is an unalloyed good, right? There are real problems with it. And I think as we've moved through and we've moved deeper into it, it's easy to forget about those problems, especially because the people that are likely to have this conversation are the people that are lucky enough to have benefited from the meritocracy. Sure. And it makes us feel good.
Let's start with kind of explaining again how this is going to relate to video games and why meritocracy seems like such a good thing. And when I say seems like such a good thing, I mean, certainly one of the things that that I'm going to ask is, if not meritocracy, then what? And we'll get to that at the end. But you think about competitions, right? In video games, it doesn't seem to matter, what your race or sex is, or your age, what your class is, right? You're just competing, and everyone seems to be competing on an equal playing field. My avatar is similar to your avatar, or at least we get to choose from a similar range of avatars. This seems really fair, right? And video games seems to be the perfect place for meritocracy in this, right? We all start from the idea of a level playing field. Don't we all start from an equal level playing field and then see the leaderboards and see where everybody is? Now, according to you, essentially, video games set up meritocracy, at least the idea, or encourage meritocracy, both in competition and also a narrative. So can you talk about that? How a narrative I thought was super, super interesting, but competition seems fundamental.
Sure. Like, I think that the first place is that we don't all start from the same place. We think we start from the same place, but that requires us to forget all of the things that we did to get to that place. So I talk about it in the book as skill transfer. When you pick up a new game, if you've played a lot of games, you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a scratch based upon, potentially, in my case, decades of having played games before. So I know generally what the buttons do. I know to look around the corners. I know that if a designer has left some sort of, I could go either way, I should explore both ways because there's probably something left for me this other place. There was actually, my partner and I were playing Overcooked last night, and we played it on the PlayStation for the first time. We'd always played it on the Switch before. And she used to play a lot of games. She hasn't played games in a while. And when she's played games, it's overwhelmingly been on the Switch. So partway through our game of Overcooked, she's complaining about her thumb hurting. And I can't even comprehend why she's complaining about her thumb hurting. And then we realized she's using the control pad as opposed to the joystick, the thumbstick, to move her character around. And it's not designed for that. It hurts. But if you look at a Switch controller, that's where the thumbstick is. It's where her hands were used to being, and she hasn't played it. So just walking into that game, the decades of experience I had, the fact that I've played more PlayStation games than she has, the fact that she was on a new controller, we weren't on a level playing field. So I think that that's part of what makes it not a level playing field. A second piece is that when we bring that into the play of games, they certainly feel meritocratic. They seem meritocratic. We put on leaderboards. We have competitions. We can rank players. We fight. We match them up against one another. When you start to look at what happens, at the very, very top of most of those ladders, they're not terribly toxic places. And at the very bottom of those ladders, they're not terribly toxic places. But when you start looking at things like Overwatch and like the 35 or 40% to the 60%, and similar with League of Legends, those places are dystopian hellholes, right? Because those people don't realize their skill level, generally speaking. And they don't understand where they're at. Whereas most of the top players understand they're top players and don't have to prove it. And most of the worst players understand they're the worst players and don't have to prove it. It's those of us in the middle, and most of us are in the middle, that don't have proper recognition of where we're at, and we think we're better than we are. So it's always our teammates' fault and not generally our fault. So I think that that's layered on top of this idea of meritocracy is the way that we interact. And we don't really have a good check and a good appreciation of all the things we bring with us, and then luck, right? And the classic example that I've got of luck, or the two classic examples of luck in video games, are XCOM and Mario, almost all the Mario games, Mario Kart and Mario Party especially, right? With XCOM, right, the designers came out and say explicitly, we have to bend the shot curve because gamers' perception of a 90% shot and what is actually a 90% shot don't line up. And when their 90% shot misses, they rage quit. So the curve is actually bent up to make people feel okay.
That's crazy.
And then, but you feel it, right? Like I'm playing through XCOM right now because I got it on the Steam sale, and like when I miss a 90% shot, I know that what the game's doing, and I am livid, right? Like that is not fair. This is not right. The world is wrong. And then like the blue shell in Mario Kart, right, is to make the game more competitive. It's to make it less meritocratic. It's to make it more fun to play with different kinds of people. And if you go through many of those Mario and Nintendo first-party games, they're designed to have a fun game with people of different skill levels.
Right.
They're not about finding who's best. So that when you get to the end of Mario Party and we're giving out rewards to the person in last place, right? And we're really determining the game by stars, not by the person who bought the most stars on the map, but who did the most based on these criteria that you don't know when you started, right? It's anti-meritocratic. So that if you come in as a person who appreciates traditional games, those produce feelings for you most likely. And they're not necessarily always good feelings, but that's what a non-meritocratic game can look like. And it doesn't mean that it's not toxic. It just means it's different.
Right. And in some ways, it doesn't even seem like it's completely unmeritocratic. It just doesn't tell you what the merits are that you're going to be judged on. Is this a matter of communication? The game is not communicating to you very well where you are skill-wise. If it did, would it be better?
I think that it would be better if players took it well, right? And under a meritocratic system, we tend to believe we're better than we think we are. Because it's seductive, right? You want to believe that you're very good. And I don't think games always teach us very well, right? They don't bring us into that. Like even, I'm not talking necessarily with a tutorial, but it's not really a fair self-assessment of where you're at. And even if you rank up in the leagues in various games, right? It's not an assessment of where you sit, because generally speaking, where you sit is also contingent upon all the people you play with. You don't get help, right? Like you don't have somebody else lifting you up. And I think that that's one of the fundamental things in game culture that I think is a problem, right? Hopefully in society, when someone's struggling, we reach out and we help lift them up. I don't think games provide for that very well. And I think that that's an area in which, as we start talking about solutions, may get into that solution realm of like being the person on the couch saying, you could do this way, right? And building those relationships to try to lift people up as opposed to cut off the ladder or push people down.
Right, I see.
I want to just kind of put a pin in the idea of cooperative games, or as a really interesting or squad-based games, or team-based games, as an interesting but maybe different case of meritocracy, and maybe get back to that later, and focus on kind of the straightforward stuff, right? So, it's interesting that you said, look, the years that I have that give me essentially years of experience, can essentially give me an advantage, right, over competitors. But of course, somebody can say, well, you made the choice. We're all essentially have the video game universe available to us. We made choices along the way. You are currently playing your previous choices, right? And your choices reflect your interest, talent, drive. Of course, the more interest you gave in a certain sphere and more dedication, of course you'll be better. And that's just part of the meritocratic process, right? We're rewarding this kind of effort. For me, when I think of the most obvious things that are unmeritocratic in a video game, it's clearly pay to win. Pay to win is, you're not judged on your skills or drive, right? You're judged on the amount of money you can bring in, right? But also to move on from that to any other skill or any other advantage that money can buy. And I'm assuming there are many, many, many advantages that money can buy, including, of course, time to play. You're
in the consoles or the games themselves, right? In many cases, right? Like, and the internet connection or all of those things. It's not a cheap hobby.
Sure. Right. So all of these seem to be situations where, even though we have this ideal meritocracy where everybody's just starting at the same level, the real world still intrudes into our magic circle in a way that does give some people advantages over others. And this is, again, before we take things that are social elements of games, like, let's say, the kind of shit that you're going to get if you're a female player, that you might not get as a male player, which means, right, you're starting at a disadvantage already, regardless of talent and drive.
Right. Race, gender, who gets socialized into it, and all those things, right? Like,
right.
I have the background in video games because when I was a kid, my parents saw me and said, you might like video games. And I got the console system and my sister didn't, right? And I got access to it and my sister didn't.
Right.
And when I get on a voice chat, right, like I'm not immediately pointed out as a girl that we want to try to get with or have to harass in some way, or a person of color who we then have to say racial slurs to, right? So like all of those barriers are very real barriers where we don't start out at the same place. Some of us start out ahead of others, and that's like the fundamental breakage of the meritocratic system. And like there's all kinds of literature and all kinds of people who've done excellent jobs studying race in games and gender in games that we can go into, but like there's tons out there. It's a problem, and that differentiates the starting blocks, right, of who gets to start where.
Right.
And that's true of anything that's competitive.
Sure, yeah, like life.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
I
of
mean,
course,
even smaller subsets of that. Like, I mean,
right.
where you start in regards to your access to having a pool to swim in will improve your chances of being an Olympic swimmer.
Or legs, or arms,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
right.
There's
Any of that stuff.
there's all kinds of things that can't be accounted for that we should try to account for. Is that sort of what the argument is?
Yeah. So let me piggyback on Andy before we get to that question, because before we get to what you see as kind of the big problems and the big solutions. Um, Game companies know this, right? I mean, game companies want to make the game, they want to level the playing field in some ways, right? They want true meritocracy. Getting rid of pay to win seems to be, one of those things, right? Other things that game companies do to try to maintain the meritocracy.
I would argue.
Yeah,
Go ahead,
I'm
Andy.
from the game industry.
Mhm.
I will say that we certainly want to maintain the illusion of the meritocracy. And we do, and we take a lot of effort to cover any problems that become obvious.
What?
That is to say, we'll solve problems once they become obvious, but it's the inobvious ones that we're not necessarily willing to go, hey, we're going to point that out. We might not even notice it. I mean, it's inobvious because it's inobvious, right? And so we might not notice it ourselves, but when we do, if it's not obvious to the player base, we might not try to find a solution for it.
Well, and that's the place where I take a walk down. The game company is not a homogenous thing, right? Like
Right.
there's not a unified game company. And to the extent that there is, I would argue that the game company's interest is in making money rather
Right.
than these other elements, right? Individual developers, individual people may have different interests.
Correct.
Then you've got the space where the game industry, by and large, is pretty homogenous, right? And
Right.
there are some companies that are more diverse than others, but it's pretty homogenous. And game players are pretty homogenous. So you combine those things together, and we don't have those moments like Andy was talking about of the inobvious thing as easily because it's not obvious to us because we're part of it, right?
Right.
To simply get to a point where the three of us can get together and talk about video games is an immense point of privilege, right? Like it's something
Sure.
that 12-year-old me would be like, you're doing what for a living? And I think part of it is just acknowledging that luck and recognizing that luck. So if I could take a detour into meritocracy just a little bit again, there's this awesome economist named Thomas Frank who writes about the meritocracy. And he argues, and with lots of evidence, he's got a great book, that luck is the primary determining factor. That we think it's skill plus hard work, but it's skill plus hard work plus luck. And if you think about the most skilled people you've ever met and the hardest working people you've ever met, and you rank them in your head, there's not that much difference when you get up to the top. Like from the top to the bottom, sure. But at the top, you've got a bunch of people that are basically indistinguishable. But then if you pull on that luck thing, the luckiest person and the least lucky person is vastly different in most cases.
Yeah.
So that what we're really talking about is in meritocracy of outcomes, we're really talking about who's the luckiest and who's the least lucky, because those differences in skill and hard work, sure, we could talk about them, and I'm sure most of the people listening are both skilled and hardworking, but those of us who have a chance to do this are also exceptionally lucky, from the breaks that we got, to where we grew up, to the families that we grew up in, to the resources we have now, to the bodies that we inhabit. All those things stack on top of each other, and then all of a sudden we think we're the winners. And that trick with meritocracy is it makes you think like you deserve it, as opposed to the fact that you were lucky. And if we start to think more about that lucky and less about that deserved it changes our perspective on how we approach things. Paul Piff, he's a psychologist, and he does this Monopoly experiment where they flip a coin at the beginning of it, and one person gets bonus stuff, and the other one starts with less. And then over the course of the game, the person who gets bonus stuff starts being rude to the person who got less. And the person who had less tends to internalize that I got less and acts less outwardly than others because they've internalized this subject position. And it was all the coin flip at the beginning that did this.
And they all know, right? I mean, it's not like it's hidden from them. It's just,
right.
There's, I think that goes back to a game a game that was designed by a psychologist in the 70s called Star Power.
So Star Power is this game that set up social hierarchy. And it picked some people that were winners and some people that were losers and divided them up into groups. And then they get rules, and the people that are in charge get to set the rules, and they inevitably disempower the people at the bottom. And then over the course of this game, the people at the bottom become disaffected. They disassociate from the game. They remove themselves. Like it's harsh, right? Like, and the people at the top don't think about the fact that, like, if I would have pulled a different chip out of the bag at the beginning, right? Because you internalize that privilege, and those are the kind of things that build up on us over time, and we don't. It's hard to turn that lens internally and critically to what we got and how we got to the spot where it is. And it's much more comfortable to attribute it to skill and hard work than luck.
One detail about star power that I wasn't able to glean from what I read about it was, are the people in the top third competing against each other?
I don't think so, but they collaborate, right?
Right.
So that, like, the people in the top third can get together and set rules that favor the top third. And unless I'm one of the ones in the top third that's really willing to go out on a limb and fight for equality, and it's much easier to just go with the flow, right? I'm winning. I'm going to keep winning. As long as I agree with y'all, I'll keep winning. It happens in, like, another one of my pleasures is reality TV shows, right? And the reality TV show, oftentimes there's a steamroll toward the end as we all realize that us in power, staying in power, even if we don't like each other tons, is useful for all of us. And that moment where it breaks is really difficult. And generally speaking, in the course of these shows, those in power tend to villainize those out of power because they need a reason to vote them out. And it's hard to think about the fact that you just didn't get with us on the first day, or we just didn't like you, or in many cases, like, we're all white and you're all people of color and we're going to vote you out for that reason. Those are uncomfortable. Thinking that they're the bad guys, that they did it to themselves, is much more comfortable, right? Because it doesn't require me to do anything. I'm right, they're wrong, I win.
Right. Okay, let me summarize what we've got up to this point. And Chris, you tell me if I got this right. So both in our society, by the way, if any listeners don't see the very obvious big picture analogy of all this, you got to be blind. All right. In our society, and in video games, right, we have this idea that there are winners and losers, and the winners and losers are the product of essentially skill and drive, right? Essentially, this idea is perpetuated by those who are winners, who use it to essentially justify their position in society, maintain their power in the system in that way. But there's a real big problem with this idea. And this idea is in some sense an improvement over what happened before, which is just people getting power in virtue of their birth rather than any kind of skills. This is a kind of broader, a broader way to power in some sense. But we still get all these problems that essentially a major part of why at least many people succeed in the system is luck, and the system doesn't seem to recognize that. It makes us kind of blind to that luck, which is ultimately setting an unjust system for us to play with. What does this do to the world of video games in terms of, what does this have to do with toxicity in video games?
Sure. So I think that I think video games are, I call it in the course of the work, I call it an actualized meritocracy, right? Like, I think that there are easier ways for us in our real lives to acknowledge the problems with meritocracy. I think that in the course of video games, it's a lot harder, right? That video games mask it better, and that video games and the tech industry's larger libertarian streak really come into play here, right? Where it becomes a lot more comfortable for us to think that the system is fair, that we're all on the same playing field, and that those people that aren't winners, that aren't good, it's their fault. And we don't have any obligation to make the system better. And that then sets us up in opposition in these really problematic ways. And then you wonder why you have a toxic community, because you built it on a toxic foundation, right? Like, if you build it on sand, it's going to fall apart. And we are far too common to build things on sand and not shore them up enough, or not do enough of the work. And then that perpetuates over time, and it becomes even harder, right? So I think that in some ways we have a harder job now than if it would have been built differently at the beginning or in through the middle years. And then I think that shows up both in the way that games are designed, and then the narratives, as you mentioned before, right? I think that the narrative of most games is You start out as a less powerful character that's fledgling and trying to find your way in the world. And then through the force of your will and your ability at the game, you get stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger. And sooner or later, you're at the top, right? And you might have a dramatic Act 2 twist where you struggle a little bit or something bad happens. But generally speaking, the line in a video game, if you play through it, is you started out weak, now you're strong, now you win, game over, which is a very traditional meritocratic narrative loop.
Right. And that's true for pretty much all single player games. Does it set up expectations for people in multiplayer games? Like, why am I not on top? I've played this game as much as I would have played a single player game, and I ended up on top of that game.
I think it's hard, right? It's the reason why, I get into there's another a woman named Emma Witkowski who does awesome work on video games, and she's a former professional basketball player. So she is an exceptional athlete, and she's done some great work on esports because she has a unique perspective. And when I sit down to play FIFA or NBA 2K against the computer, I want to win. I want to win by a lot. I'm not looking to get challenged. I'm looking to win. Whereas she is looking to get better, so that she takes some L's because she's used to this different perspective on how that game should play than I am, which I think is interesting in the way I was acculturated to games.
Which is interesting.
I'm sort of interested in why you are interested in just crushing the game system as opposed to challenging yourself with something that's a little bit more challenging.
It depends on what I want at the moment, right? Mm-hmm. Like I'll turn it up and down, but oftentimes when I play games to relax, and in a small window of time. So I don't want to get strife out of it. I want to get victory out of it. So it's a question of the emotion I want to feel.
Gotcha.
Then if I were going to go play FIFA against people and I was going to enter into a small competition, right? I would want to play against a more difficult computer opponent so that I got better. But for the most part, if I'm just kicking it after the kids are in bed, I don't want to struggle. I want to dominate. And the easiest way to dominate is turn that difficulty down a little bit. I can score a lot of goals, and scoring goals is fun.
Okay.
Yeah, it's interesting because, both are a component of the, I think so much of playing to get better. But what is the point of getting better? It's to have better high-level competitions where eventually you can win, right? So, getting better is it's still the direction we get to victory. But of course, again, getting better is going to be a consequence of my talent, which is mostly, genetic and developed by my parents and community, etc., and the opportunity I have, especially as a parent, for how much time I get to play, these days. Right. I want to go now to this idea of whether the problem is competition itself. I mean, part of what we get in so many games is competition, and not all games, but let's say is the idea that competition itself kind of breeds out. You want your competition to be a fair competition. You want your victory to be earned. Does that automatically drive a meritocracy? And given that we have mostly competitive games, is meritocracy kind of the natural product of competition?
So I'll take a little dalliance away from video games and talk about sports for a minute.
Okay.
In most sports, it's understood that the victor is often the luckiest rather than the best. Now, they are very good. They are excellent, but they are often very lucky to get there. So that all kinds of athletes, like there's a great quote from Sandy Koufax where he talks about to pitch a perfect game, you have to get lucky. Because you can pitch the best game, but you need one or two breaks in any perfect game that are that are sheer luck in order to reach that level of excellence. If you think about the NCAA basketball tournament that garners billions of dollars for the NCAA, it's a single elimination tournament. That makes it exciting. It also means the best team is highly unlikely to win because they have to win so many games and overcome so many lucky moments in order to get to that point. It's American-style playoffs in all of our sports are more about luck than about long-run success.
Right, and there's a term for it, and it's any given Sunday.
It's why each football game, NFL football game, matters more than each baseball game, right? Because there are 162 baseball games and there are 17 football games. So that if you make a mistake in this one thing, we were watching the Cheer documentary, right? Or the Cheer show on Netflix, right? The thing that's interesting about competitive cheerleading is they have 2 performances that are 2 minutes and 15 seconds long, and anybody makes a mistake, your whole year's wasted, right? So like the pressure on that moment is insane, right?
Yeah.
You could have done it correctly 50 times, and you get up for 51, your foot goes wrong or you slip, and all of a sudden your season's over, which is just,
But
that's wild.
but of course, right? Everybody's subject to this luck, and the harder you work on it, and the more talented you are, the less likely you are to have the bad luck, and more likely to have the good luck, right? If that counts, right?
But that foregrounded acknowledgement that the luck matters,
Right.
I think changes the reception of it.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean to an extent, right? But again, if I'm defending the meritocracy, I'm going to say yes, and we have an equal playing field where we all essentially are dealing with luck in the same way. There's a sense where we could still say, okay, not everything that turned out was exactly the product of skill, but have faith in the system as a whole, as generally speaking, bringing out the best, because the best essentially place themselves in the best position with regards to luck.
I would concede to some extent that those who are victors are likely to be exceptionally hardworking and exceptionally talented. The argument that I'm trying to craft out is that's not the only piece there.
Right.
And far too often with video games, we focus on those pieces and not the other piece as well. And my contention is that other piece matters more than those other two. Because at the point that you get to a suitably high level of competition, like every NBA basketball player could dunk on any of us, could obliterate us. Like there are retired NBA players who show up at the playground and just make fools of people who think they can challenge them because your worst player in the NBA is still so much better than the average human, just so exceptional in comparison. No amount of luck will even that for me. Like it's just not going to happen.
Right.
But at that level of competition where everyone is talented, luck matters a ton. So certain people are still going to be more talented than others. They're going to be more capable. It's why you have arguments about who's the best or who's the best of all time and things like that. And you can actually have a discussion. But it also matters where you end up, right? We could talk about where a person gets drafted or where they show up or what coach they have or what home life situation they have when they get there, what mentoring they have in order to bring them in. All those things matter too. And those things are often determinate when you get to that substantially high level of competition that the vast majority of us are just never going to reach, right? Like we're just not.
Right. And you're talking about how much do the game companies know this and how much they recognize it? And I can tell you that there's lots of game design blogs from the people who make Magic the Gathering, collectible card game, and competitive, highly competitive collectible card game. And they tune
also pay to win card game.
Yes.
Yes, of course.
Yes.
And to a degree, right? You need to have the best cards, but you really don't need that many of them. They've got a specific target for their tuning, which is 33% luck, 33% cards you have, and 33% skill. And that's so that and they've tuned it that way so that there's a small chance that a brand new player will beat an experienced player in certain situations.
So I guess I'm asking with regards to luck. So is it that we need to question the entire idea of meritocracy in video games, or we need to be aware that at some point luck enters the picture?
I think in part, yes. And I think part of it's just about reflecting on how we got to where we are and not get seduced by the idea that we earned it. Right? That's the primary problem, is that when we think that we earned it and we are better than, right? There are two psychologists or sociologists who ran some studies, and their names are Shannon McCoy and Brenda Major. And they make the argument that anytime we get a meritocratic cue, like get to think about meritocracy, we tend to defend the status quo. Like our back gets up, we start to defend what we're there, even for those people who aren't successful. That's the seductive part, because if the system is really about luck and hard work and skill, I can provide that. I can do that, right? So that we tend to defend that, and we don't think introspectively about, all this other stuff's going on that doesn't seem like hard work and skill. All of these other things came into being that complicate it. And I think it's mostly for me about recognizing those things and trying to equalize things where we can and focusing on lifting up rather than pushing down, right? I am not better than someone because I beat them in the game. I beat them in a game in that moment, right? I had a moment of NBA 2K where I was playing online with a bunch of people, and I was having the game of my life. I don't know what happened, what inhibited me. Like I am average or worse, probably worse to be honest, But I was having this game where I was doing really well. They were talking about me as at the end of the game, the other team said they were lucky to have me on the team, right? With some choice profofanity. I felt really good, but I understood. I was incredibly lucky that game. I don't know what happened to make so it didn't lead to tension in the same sort of way because I knew that the next game, like I had to tell my teammates as we went into the next game, I am not really that good. I don't know what happened, but don't count on me like that in this one. I will do my best, but
right.
And it built a relationship where we could then go on and we rattled off a couple of wins and it was fun and we were positive with each other, right? And that was nice.
So what kind of steps do you have in mind then? Yeah, I mean, is the idea to question meritocracy or just to qualify the meritocracy?
I think questioning is generally a good thing, right? Asking hard questions is generally good about how you got to where you are. Critical self-reflection is an important thing about the way that things work and the privileges that we bring with us, right? To talk about how video games can do things differently. One of the things that's been very interesting for me over this winter break is we were snowed in for a week and then we had a COVID scare at daycare and all kinds of things is our 4-year-old, about to be five years old tomorrow, has taken up a penchant for the PlayStation 5. And she loves Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. And one of the reasons she loves Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart is I can set up the game such that she doesn't get obliterated every time she steps onto it. Right. They have really fine difficulty settings. They have a simpler mode that she can play with her small hands on that controller. And she loves it because it can be set up for her in a way that can bring her in a way that is appropriate for her as opposed to just beating the crud out of her where she'd get pushed away from it. I think that those differential difficulty settings, bringing people in a different sort of way. And also the cues to remind folks that, you didn't earn it. You're here through a variety of different things that got you here. Appreciate that and try to lift other people up too.
I think a lot of people are going to have some problem with you didn't earn it, right? I mean, isn't there at some point where I can say I earned it? Maybe not. Maybe that luck wasn't completely eliminated, but the majority of the effort and skill and practice paid off, and there is a cause and effect connection here.
No, I was going to say, I think the solution to that is what he was talking about these granular difficulty levels, right? Because people like to feel the progress. And the progress they're making is real, and that is skill, and that is, from the place that they start to the place that they end is all them. It's the place that they start necessarily that is the big question, right? So if you have a granular enough difficulty progression level, you can reward people for the skill that they are legitimately getting, while also showing them that they're overcoming bad luck when they do.
And for individual players in multiplayer settings and for designers, I would encourage them to think about the obligation that they have to reach out and reach down, right? How can we encourage other people here? With my skill and my hard work, I've gotten to this phase. How can I get other people with me too? So instead of pointing the fingers at your teammates and wondering why they aren't doing as well, if you are successful, trying to lift them up around you, all of a sudden changes the context for the game. And it becomes less about, I had a favorite rec soccer game I played in Alabama when I was there. And it was just a beautiful game because there were people of wildly different skills. But whenever a team was dominating, we switched the teams. So the perfect game was playing to a tie, right? And we all had fun at wildly different skill and fitness levels. And when somebody came in who wanted to dominate the game and win, they were quickly shown the door because they didn't like playing that way. So the balance, the equilibrium of the game became, we were playing for fun, and it wasn't fun if one team was getting wrecked. We wanted everybody to be able to play and have fun at different skill levels. And it was just this magical moment. I haven't been able to recapture it since, right? Because it takes a lot of people and the right balance in order to get there, right? And the right attitude and the right knees in order to survive the game. But finding those moments where we're more focused on communing with each other and being together with each other, and lifting each other up. I think that's an attitude that if we take that into games, and if developers do what they can to encourage that moment in games, I think it matters. So on a specific game developer example, right, there's a game called Monaco, which is a cooperative heist game. And basically, you're multiple people coming in to try to steal stuff. And the developers realized really early that would be troll heaven, right? Because if I'm the getaway driver and I just drive away,
Right.
y'all lose, right?
Right.
And that's great fun for me if I'm trolling.
Right.
So they did everything they could in the beta community to seed it with people that would play in a pro-social way. And shockingly, more players played in a pro-social way because that was the way they were normed in. It doesn't mean they didn't have problems that they had to address, but setting it up that way and designing it in such a way that people were encouraged to play with each other, for each other, made a fundamentally different game. And if you have a couple jerks in that game, it breaks in a hurry, right? Like it just does not work.
Right. I can also see game developers creating sort of a mentor role for more experienced players to take on a younger player, a new player, and help them along in some way, and then get rewarded for that.
There's a thing called EVE University in EVE Online, and it's one of the few pro-social moments of EVE Online, where it's a group of people that are, and it's more the players in part that protect EVE University than anything else, because they understand if nobody comes into our game is not going to exist anymore. So the players often protect, like this is the one community, the one corporation that nobody's going to mess with. Because if anybody does, the wrath of everyone falls down on them, which is interesting, right? And it's an obscure game. It's a hard game. It's a mountain of learning that has to be done in that game. So it has a real function. But I think that came out of that game especially is interesting and notable.
In a meritocracy, right, we're normally thinking about where we end up, right? Whether we win or lose essentially determines how good we are. Right. So the value we're looking for is victory or betterment towards victory. Right. Either one of these things. Should we be looking for different values?
Maybe. Right. That might be an interesting thing to chase. Right. Like, can we find ways to find other joy in the moment? Right. When I play with my daughters, I'm playing differently than I would play in a different context. When I'm playing recreationally or with my partner, I'm playing differently than I would play in a different context, right? And finding those moments where you can enjoy something different, enjoy something for its own sake, it can bring light in a different kind of way, and also realizing when it's time to quit, right? What's one of the things that games are doing now more with prompts, especially competitive games, of like, maybe you should take a little break right now. If this game isn't going so well from you, like, take a little time. And I think it's one of the hard parts of design for games like League of Legends. Like, it becomes drudgery after like 20 minutes when you know you're going to lose and you still got to sit there for another 10 minutes and lose, right? Like, it's just, that's not fun. So finding those moments and finding those elements of design and finding those spaces for play that bring what you want, whether that be joy, whether that be learning, whether that be something else, because games can do much more than just fun, right? They can do all kinds of things. But finding those spaces where you're getting what you want from that moment, I think is important, and reflecting on what you need, right? Puts you in a different position, puts you in a different place.
We've been talking about meritocracy in video games. Obviously, there are real world analogs here. Is there a lesson for us about society outside of video games?
Yes.
Great. How big? It's like how much time have you got, right?
But I think it is a space in which like there are all these moments where video games can evidence other things about society and other things about how things work. I think it's one of the things that makes this podcast interesting as a whole, right? Is that you can take this lesson from video games and apply it in a different space or learn something different, right? We're talking about ethics in video games and going from Gamergate to what happened on the internet to the rise of the alt-right, right? All those things you can trace, like that I would largely locate within video games, and there were origin points there. So this is a chance where perhaps we can take some lessons from video games and apply them in a different context and start to understand different ways in which a group could be structured or things could happen, right? And I think that it's often easier to do that within the space of games sometimes because they're not so tied to us, right? It's not who I am. It's a part of who I am, potentially, but it's not who I am in the same sort of fundamental way. And if I can explore with that part of Chris and problematize that part of Chris, maybe I can take those lessons into a different context that's weightier and use them there.
Right. Certainly, the games allow us an almost safe space, a much safer space to experiment with some ideas and experiment with some social structures. Like, how do we get the people who are playing at the top? How do we reward the people who are playing at the top levels of a game? How do we reward them for expanding the number of people playing at the top levels of the game? Like, how do we reward players for creating upward mobility?
Oh, wow. I'm thinking, all of a sudden I'm thinking about that from a business perspective, because in some sense you're drawing more people to the game to begin with, right? And the more you have people at the top, the more the competition, the skill levels is high, the competition is interesting, other people want in.
Right. It should be a no-brainer, right?
Yeah.
It's a question of, are we pitted against each other or are we with each other? And if we're pitted against each other, that leads to a very different set of outcomes than if we're with each other. And if we're with each other, we can approach things differently. So that while games are a safe space for some of us and not as much for others, right? Expanding that safe space to those others that may be interested already makes it a richer space, right? And then bringing those people in and enculturating them in a way that we are comfortable enough to learn from and adjust to and realize that what we have is cool, but it can be even cooler if we work together. Now that's something that I'm really excited about, right? Because I can get more of what I had already, and that's not really interesting. I want the new of like, what can we do together to make something interesting and valuable for all of us?
On that note, thank you very much, Chris Paul from Seattle University. Great having you. I think you give us lots and lots to think about, man. All right, good podcast, guys.
Thanks, Shaw.
Play nice, everybody.